In the far reaches of the galaxy, countless civilizations lived under the veil of distant stars, often isolated by the immense emptiness of space. Each planet had its own way of life, its own rules, and its own struggles. Some worlds were technologically advanced, their cities stretching across continents, orbiting satellites, forming a delicate web of communication. Others remained primitive, their inhabitants relying on basic tools, farming, and a careful understanding of the environment to survive. Life across these worlds was fragile, and peace was often maintained not by friendship, but by fear of the unknown and respect for the power that others might wield. Among the many tales whispered in the quiet corners of interstellar space, there was one that consistently drew attention and fear: the story of the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were humans, but not ordinary humans like those found on the more peaceful colonies of Earth. These humans were forged in some of the harshest conditions known in the galaxy. Their home planets were death worlds in the truest sense, planets where life itself was an endless struggle against hostile environments. Violent storms, poisonous atmospheres, savage predators, and relentless radiation were everyday realities. Only the strongest survived, and only the cleverest thrived. The humans who came from these worlds developed extraordinary physical strength, unmatched endurance, and mental resilience that seemed almost unnatural. Over generations, these traits became a part of their very nature. From birth, a child in a death world was trained to survive, to fight, and to endure pain that would break most ordinary beings. Because of these origins, the Deathworlders became known across the galaxy not only for their survival skills, but also for their approach to conflict. They did not negotiate lightly, they did not retreat easily, and they certainly did not forgive mistakes that endangered them or others. Rumors spread across alien sectors that a single Deathworlder warrior could overcome dozens of foes, and that an entire fleet of Deathworlder ships could annihilate entire military divisions before the enemy even understood what had happened. For many civilizations, these stories were almost too terrifying to believe. Some dismissed them as exaggerations, tales told by nervous traders to explain why their convoys never returned from the Outer Rim. Others, more cautious and experienced, treated the rumors as warnings. In every case, the name Deathworlders evoked a sense of awe and fear that was universal, despite their reputation for aggression. The Deathworlders were not mindless destroyers. They had a strict code, a doctrine of survival and justice that guided their actions. They responded to threats decisively and without hesitation, and they were bound by a unique sense of loyalty both to each other and to causes they deemed worthy. They were protectors of their own, punishers of those who threatened the innocent, and relentless hunters of those who dared challenge their strength. Across countless sectors, alien historians and scholars debated the morality of the Deathworlders. Some argued that their methods were brutal, even terrifying, but that they were often more just than the governments and militaries of many alien civilizations. Others claimed that the Deathworlders were a force of nature, impartial and indifferent, whose wrath could never be predicted or contained. In the quiet of space, many planets had never even seen a human. Those that had usually witnessed only a fleeting presence, a scouting vessel, a diplomatic envoy, or, in some cases, a swift military action that left lasting impressions. On these occasions, the stories of the Deathworlders spread quickly, growing with each retelling. Merchants whispered about the strange design of their ships, built to endure extreme conditions, faster and more resilient than anything their technologies could match. Pilots spoke of the tactics they used, unpredictable and brutal, exploiting weaknesses in ways that no alien strategist could anticipate. Children on distant worlds grew up hearing stories of human warriors who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, often leaving entire fleets of enemies in ruins. But the galaxy was vast, and not everyone had heard of the Deathworlders, or at least not in a way that conveyed their true power. Some civilizations continued their daily lives without concern, trusting in the protection of their own fleets or the alliances they had formed. Others relied on the assumption that a species so far away could not possibly interfere in their affairs. And yet, the Deathworlders' reach extended farther than most imagined. A single signal, a distress call from a remote planet, could trigger a response that would ripple across star systems, leaving entire worlds changed forever. It was this capacity for swift, overwhelming action that made them both feared and respected. The legend of the Deathworlders was not just built on physical power, but also on intelligence and strategy. While many imagined them as simple warriors, they were also highly skilled tacticians and engineers. Their ships were marvels of design, equipped to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary vessels. They could navigate asteroid fields with precision, strike from impossible angles, and deploy forces in ways that confounded even the most advanced alien fleets. Each soldier, each captain, each strategist was trained to anticipate enemy moves, adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and execute plans with lethal efficiency. This combination of raw power and meticulous planning made them nearly unstoppable in situations where others would falter. But it was not only their strength and strategy that set them apart. The Deathworlders were driven by a deep sense of purpose. They had survived worlds that would have ended entire civilizations, and this survival had instilled a collective identity that valued endurance, loyalty, and action. They did not act for fame, for wealth, or for conquest in the ordinary sense. They acted because their nature compelled them to respond to injustice, danger, and challenges that required intervention. Across the galaxy, even those who feared them recognized that when the Deathworlders acted, it was rarely for personal gain, it was often for the balance of power, for protection, or to enforce consequences on those who threatened life and order. Among the many alien civilizations who knew of the Deathworlders, there was a general consensus. If you ever found yourself in a situation where help might come from them, it was both a blessing and a terrifying uncertainty. You could be saved from certain destruction, but you could also witness power unlike anything you had ever imagined. The Deathworlders did not negotiate slowly or politely. They did not issue warnings or ultimatums unless absolutely necessary. They acted, and when they did, the results were absolute. This duality, a potential savior and an unstoppable force of wrath, defined their place in galactic lore. As these stories circulated, a sense of unease spread quietly in certain sectors. Military leaders studied the Deathworlders' tactics, hoping to understand them and perhaps replicate their efficiency. Scholars wrote tomes attempting to analyze their psychology, their strategies, and their cultural values. Even artists and storytellers were captivated, painting pictures and composing songs of heroic victories and devastating assaults. The image of the Deathworlders became almost mythical, a symbol of survival against impossible odds, of strength tempered by intelligence, of wrath tempered by purpose. It was into this backdrop that a small, isolated planet sent out a distress signal, unaware of the legend it was about to awaken. For this planet, the Deathworlders were unknown in reality. Only a name whispered across light years. The inhabitants had no idea that their plea for aid would not simply bring a friendly fleet to defend them. Instead, it would call forth an unstoppable force of human warriors whose skills, tactics, and sheer ferocity had been honed over generations to a level unmatched in the galaxy. The SOS signal, meant as a cry for help, would act as a catalyst, summoning the Deathworlders not out of coincidence, but because the universe itself seemed to recognize when their intervention was required. In this way, the stage was set. The galaxy continued its rhythm of daily life, oblivious to the approaching storm. Traders continued their routes, scientists continued their experiments, and families on countless worlds went about their routines. Yet, somewhere far beyond the edge of known space, a single SOS was drifting, a message of desperation and hope, heading straight toward a civilization whose very name inspired both salvation and fear. What was about to unfold would not only challenge the aliens who sent the call for help, but would also further cement the Deathworlders' place in galactic history, a story of wrath, justice, and survival that would be told for generations. And so, in the silence between stars, the Deathworlders prepared to act, their ships waiting, their warriors ready, their minds focused. They had survived the deadliest worlds and conquered impossible challenges. Now a simple call for help would set them in motion once more, bringing them from legend into reality, and setting the galaxy on a path that would forever remember. The day an SOS awakened the wrath of humanity's most fearsome fleet. Asterisk on the distant, isolated planet of Thrin. Life had always been difficult. The planet was not harsh like the Deathworlds, but it had its own challenges. Its atmosphere was thick and slightly toxic to non-native life, forcing its inhabitants to build complex filtration systems just to breathe safely outdoors. The gravity was higher than most nearby worlds, making movement exhausting for those unaccustomed to it. Storms of acidic rain were frequent, destroying crops and homes alike, and the oceans were infested with massive predators that could devour an entire fishing boat in minutes. Despite these dangers, the Thrinians had adapted. Over centuries, they had built cities on elevated plateaus and constructed protective domes over their most vulnerable settlements. Their society was built around cooperation, careful planning, and respect for the unpredictable forces of their world. For generations, the Thrinians had lived peacefully, though cautiously. They traded with nearby star systems, exchanging rare minerals, spices, and intricate technology for food, medicine, and other necessities. Yet, even with these alliances, Thrin remained vulnerable. Its fleets were small and its weapons limited. The planet could not defend itself against a large, organized attack, and unfortunately this weakness had not gone unnoticed. One day, reports began to arrive that a hostile alien force had been moving through nearby sectors. At first, the Thrinians did not think much of it. Many star systems had small skirmishes now and then, and they had assumed these reports were exaggerated. But the news soon became undeniable. Entire colonies were being attacked, ships were disappearing, and communication signals from certain sectors went silent. Panic began to creep into the Thrinian cities. Traders returned early, merchants stayed in their homes, and the Planetary Council convened emergency meetings to discuss the growing threat. The aliens approaching Thrin were unlike anything the planet had faced before. They were technologically advanced, with ships capable of moving faster than anything Thrin had ever built or seen. Their weapons could pierce the strongest domes, Their drones could infiltrate and disable defense systems, and their soldiers were ruthless and trained for conquest. The first clashes were devastating. Thrin's few defensive ships were quickly destroyed. Outposts on the planet's surface fell, leaving entire towns exposed. Panic spread, and the once-calm citizens began to fear that Thrin might not survive the attack. The Planetary Council, composed of the wisest and most experienced leaders, realized the gravity of the situation. Their technology and fleets were no match for this enemy. Even neighboring allies were too distant to arrive in time. The Council debated every possible strategy: negotiate, surrender, hide, or fight. None of these options seemed viable. Negotiation was pointless, as the enemy demanded complete control. Surrender would mean the end of Thrin's culture and possibly the extinction of its people. Hiding was impractical because the aliens were systematically scanning every sector, and fighting was impossible, given the overwhelming difference in power. Desperation grew. For weeks, the Thrinians attempted every defensive measure they could think of. They reinforced their cities, evacuated non-essential citizens, and tried to rally their military. Yet, each day brought news of further destruction. Entire fleets were annihilated, their defensive satellites destroyed, and communication networks disrupted. Morale plummeted. Fear was no longer a simple emotion, it was a constant companion, gnawing at every citizen, every soldier, every leader. Families huddled together in fortified shelters, listening to the distant sounds of destruction outside their domes. Children asked questions their parents could not answer, and elders told stories of a time when Thrin was strong and safe, stories that now felt like distant dreams. It was in this dire situation that the Council made a decision that would change everything. They decided to send a plea for help to the wider galaxy. It was a bold and risky move. Sending an SOS meant that they were acknowledging their weakness, and in some civilizations, such a signal might have invited further attacks, but the Council had little choice. The planet's very survival depended on finding assistance, and they had exhausted every other option. The SOS transmission was not simple. The Thrinians carefully encoded their message, attempting to reach civilizations known for their sense of justice, fairness, or willingness to help. They included detailed information about their attackers, the extent of the threat, and the desperate situation on their world. Every word was chosen with care, every detail designed to convey the severity of their plight. They hoped the message would reach a nearby ally capable of sending aid. What they did not know was that this signal would travel much farther than intended, ultimately crossing paths with a civilization whose reputation inspired both awe and terror. Deathworlders. The SOS drifted through the vast emptiness of space, passing through countless systems and hyperspace corridors. Along its journey, it passed by worlds that were indifferent, civilizations that ignored it, and even traders who intercepted it but did not understand its significance. Finally, it reached the outer rim of known space, where human scouts were monitoring the galaxy. The signal was detected immediately. Unlike most civilizations, the Deathworlders did not dismiss or underestimate incoming messages. Their protocols demanded that every SOS be assessed, every plea for help carefully evaluated. This was not simply a matter of curiosity, it was a fundamental aspect of their survival philosophy. The Deathworlders had learned, through countless encounters and battles, that even a distant signal could indicate a threat, an opportunity, or a call for justice. When the Deathworlders intercepted Thrin's SOS, their analysts quickly deciphered its contents. They were struck by the combination of urgency, precision, and desperation. The message was not a casual report. It was a detailed account of a planet under siege, its people facing extinction at the hands of a technologically superior enemy. While some civilizations might have sent cautious envoys or debated for months, the Deathworlders immediately recognized the situation as critical. In their eyes, any sentient life under threat warranted attention, especially if it could be saved through decisive action. Back on Thrin, the inhabitants had no idea that their message had reached such a powerful audience. They assumed that help might come eventually, perhaps weeks or months later, and they continued their desperate attempts to defend their cities. The Planetary Council coordinated what little resources remained, trying to protect civilians while keeping some forces in reserve for counterattacks. Every day was a struggle. Resources ran low, shelters filled beyond capacity, and the constant threat of enemy assaults left no room for rest. Leaders and citizens alike faced a growing sense of hopelessness, believing that their civilization might vanish before any aid could arrive. The Thrinians also underestimated the nature of the help that was coming. They had reached out to civilizations known for diplomacy or military support, expecting reinforcements that would integrate with their own defenses. They had not anticipated that the signal would trigger a response from a race whose very existence was defined by survival, combat, and the unflinching enforcement of their will. The Deathworlders did not operate like ordinary allies. Their approach was absolute, decisive, and often terrifying. For the Thrinians, this was a truth they would only understand when the fleet arrived. Meanwhile, the enemy forces continued their advance. Every attempt to repel them failed, and every success was fleeting. The Thrinians' hope rested solely on the promise of aid, yet even this hope was fragile. Many began to believe that no one would come, that their cries for help had vanished into the void of space, unheard and unanswered. The cities, once vibrant and thriving, now bore the scars of repeated attacks. Streets were littered with debris, communication towers toppled, and defensive walls breached. Families moved from shelter to shelter, seeking safety wherever they could, and soldiers fought battles with dwindling supplies and dwindling morale. Amid this chaos, the decision to send an SOS became the central focus of the Planetary Council. They held meetings in secret, planning the transmission, calculating frequencies, and determining the content of the message. Every detail was debated: how to describe their attackers without exaggeration, how to emphasize the urgency without causing panic, and how to ensure the message would reach as far as possible. The Council understood that this signal was the Thrinians' last hope, their final act in a situation where every other option had failed. It was a gamble, one that could either save their world or leave it exposed to further destruction. And so, after weeks of preparation, the SOS was finally transmitted. The message leaped into the void, riding on beams of light across the empty expanses of space. It carried with it the hopes, fears, and survival instincts of an entire civilization. On Thrin, citizens watched the night sky, not knowing if the transmission would be received or if it would simply fade into the darkness. Soldiers stood watch, parents comforted children, and leaders prayed silently for aid from somewhere. Anyone who might intervene before it was too late. Unbeknownst to them, the signal was already moving faster than they could imagine, crossing sectors and systems with the inevitability of destiny. It was about to reach ears that would not only hear their cries but respond in a manner that no Thrinians could have anticipated. The events that followed would not simply save the planet, they would reshape the very understanding of power, survival, and the consequences of sending a call for help across the galaxy. And in this fragile moment, as Thrin faced its darkest hours, the seeds were sown for an encounter that would forever mark its history: a meeting between desperate civilians and a civilization whose strength, wrath, and loyalty were unmatched anywhere in the universe. The SOS, humble in origin yet monumental in consequence, was about to change everything. The SOS signal from Thrin had traveled across countless light-years, weaving its way through the endless expanse of stars, until it finally reached the outer rim of human-controlled space. For the Deathworlders, such messages were never ignored. Unlike most civilizations, they did not debate endlessly over who should respond or whether it was worth the effort. Each call for help was evaluated with precision and urgency, for they had learned that delay could mean disaster, not just for those sending the plea, but for the balance of power across the galaxy. Upon intercepting the Thrinian message, the Deathworlders' command centers lit up with activity. Analysts and strategists gathered around holographic displays, running simulations and calculating response options. Every detail in the message was scrutinized. The Thrinians had described the nature of their attackers, the extent of their defenses, and the devastation already wrought on their cities. They spoke of fear, desperation, and a very real possibility of extinction. For the Deathworlders, these were not mere words, they were triggers for action. The Council quickly recognized that a decisive response was required, one that would not merely defend Thrin but eliminate the threat entirely. The fleet began to mobilize. Thousands of ships, ranging from massive war carriers to smaller, faster attack vessels, powered up their engines. Each vessel had been built to endure extreme conditions and deliver overwhelming force. On board, soldiers prepared for combat, reviewing strategies and checking equipment. These were not ordinary humans, they were Deathworlders, trained from birth to face the deadliest conditions, to fight without hesitation, and to survive when others would fall. They had been forged in some of the harshest worlds, and now they were moving toward a distant, endangered planet, ready to unleash their strength. Meanwhile, back on Thrin, the inhabitants continued to struggle against their attackers. Their defenses, though valiant, were crumbling under the sheer power and advanced technology of the enemy forces. The alien attackers were relentless, striking swiftly and retreating before counterattacks could be organized. Outposts fell, communication lines were severed, and supply routes were destroyed. Every victory the Thrinians achieved was temporary. Every strategy quickly countered. Panic and despair spread throughout the cities. Families hid in shelters, soldiers pushed themselves to the limits, and leaders worked tirelessly to coordinate what remained of their forces. The arrival of the Deathworlders' fleet would not be subtle. These humans did not approach slowly or diplomatically. They did not send envoys or warnings. Their doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and overwhelming force. Every ship and every soldier was trained to strike decisively, leaving no opportunity for the enemy to regroup. This made their approach terrifying not just to the Thrinians' attackers, but to neighboring civilizations who might witness the fleet's arrival. Rumors began to spread in nearby sectors. An unknown human fleet was approaching, and it was unlike anything anyone had encountered. Traders whispered of their capabilities, militaries scrambled to assess the threat, and scholars debated what this meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. For the Thrinians, the fleet's approach was initially a mystery. They saw strange signals on their scanners, large objects moving faster than anything they had ever tracked. At first, they assumed these were reinforcements from nearby allies, though they quickly realized that the scale and precision of the movements suggested something far greater. The fleet was vast, coordinated with perfect timing, and its trajectory pointed directly at the conflict zones. Citizens watched the skies with a mix of hope and fear, unsure whether salvation or destruction was arriving. The alien attackers, however, were already aware that something was approaching. Their sensors detected ships moving at incredible speeds, formations that suggested sophisticated tactics and unparalleled organization. Panic spread among their ranks. They had expected resistance from the Thrinians, but nothing could have prepared them for the magnitude of the force now bearing down upon them. Commanders tried to regroup, issuing orders to reposition forces, reinforce defenses, and launch preemptive strikes. But it was too late. The Deathworlders did not wait for negotiations or opportunities to surrender. They acted. The first encounter was sudden and overwhelming. The Deathworlders struck with a combination of speed and power that left the enemy disoriented. Their ships moved in precise formations, using angles and trajectories that exploited weaknesses in the alien vessels. Weapons systems fired with deadly accuracy, and boarding teams deployed rapidly to neutralize key targets. Entire battle groups were incapacitated before they could even respond effectively. For the first time, the Thrinians truly saw the power of the Deathworlders, not just in their firepower, but in the coordination, strategy, and sheer efficiency of their attacks. On the surface of citizens watched the unfolding battle through shields and communication feeds. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Cities that had been on the brink of destruction suddenly had a chance at survival. Enemy forces were being dismantled with precision, yet the scale of destruction was unlike anything they had witnessed before. Explosions lit the skies, alien ships were ripped apart mid-flight, and the noise of battle reverberated across space. The Thrinians felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because the attackers were being defeated. Fear because the force fighting for them was unlike anything they had ever known, brutal, efficient, and utterly relentless. Despite the overwhelming assault, the enemy forces did not surrender immediately. They attempted to regroup, deploying reinforcements and launching but the Deathworlders anticipated these moves. Using intelligence gathered from the SOS and their own reconnaissance, they predicted enemy strategies and countered them before they could take effect. Each action was calculated, every maneuver executed with precision. The alien attackers began to realize that they were not dealing with ordinary humans or conventional forces. They were facing a civilization that had survived the deadliest worlds, trained for combat from birth, and guided by a doctrine that allowed no hesitation. As the battle continued, the Thrinians began to understand the nature of the aid they had received. These humans did not merely defend, they eliminated threats entirely. Where the Thrinians had hoped for reinforcements to assist their defenses, the Deathworlders acted as both shield and sword, striking directly at the enemy's core forces. The attackers' fleets were decimated, their ground operations disrupted, and their leadership shattered. Entire divisions of enemy soldiers were neutralized before they could fully comprehend the scale of the assault. For the first time, the Thrinians felt a sense of safety, though it was accompanied by awe at the raw power and efficiency of their saviors. Neighboring systems could not ignore what was happening. Reports of the Deathworlders' fleet reached other civilizations, some of whom had previously underestimated humanity. Observers noted the precision, speed, and scale of the attacks, realizing that the Thrinians were not just receiving aid, they were witnessing an entirely new form of military intervention. Strategists and scholars began to analyze the tactics, trying to understand how a fleet of this size and efficiency could operate without significant losses. Discussions and debates spread across the galaxy, with some civilizations praising the Deathworlders' methods, while others feared the implications of their power on Thrinn itself. Life was still fraught with danger, but hope began to grow. Families cautiously emerged from shelters, children watched the sky in wonder, and leaders coordinated with the Deathworlders to ensure the survival of their citizens. Yet, even as they celebrated small victories, the scale of the conflict remained clear. The enemy had been formidable, and the destruction wrought before the Deathworlders' arrival left lasting scars. Cities were in ruins, vital infrastructure destroyed, and many lives had already been lost. Survival was still a challenge, but now it was possible. Throughout the conflict, the Deathworlders remained relentless. Their approach was methodical, combining speed, strategy, and overwhelming force. No opportunity was wasted, and no threat was left unchecked. They neutralized enemy reinforcements before they could land, disabled communication networks to prevent coordination, and deployed ground teams to secure critical areas. The alien forces, despite their technological superiority, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Their confidence eroded, replaced by confusion and fear as they realized the true nature of their opponent. Who had once believed their situation hopeless, now began to see the power of a civilization forged in extreme conditions. The Deathworlders did not act with malice toward them, they were saviors, but their methods were absolute. Every action was decisive, every maneuver calculated, and every enemy threat eliminated without hesitation. For the Thrinians, This was both a lesson in survival and a revelation about the universe they inhabited. Aid could arrive in forms far beyond their understanding, and sometimes salvation could be terrifying in its intensity. As the battle raged, the stage was set for the next phase of the conflict. The Deathworlders had shown their strength, disrupted the enemy forces, and established dominance over the battlefield. But the enemy was still formidable, and the war for Thrin's survival was not yet complete. For the Thrinians, every passing moment was a reminder of both the danger they had faced and the extraordinary intervention that had come to their aid. Their world, once on the brink of annihilation, now had a chance not only to survive but to learn from the power and precision of a civilization unlike any they had ever encountered. And in this tense, chaotic environment, the rising conflict continued to escalate, bringing with it lessons about courage, desperation, and the unexpected forms that salvation could take. The galaxy watched, and Thrin began to understand that their SOS had not just called for help. It had awakened a force capable of changing the course of history. The battle for Thrin had reached a level of intensity that few could have imagined. The enemy forces, once confident and aggressive, were now reeling under the relentless assault of the Deathworlders. Every strike seemed to anticipate their next move. Every maneuver counted before it could be executed. The Thrinians, who had been hiding in shelters and fortresses, watched in a mixture of awe, hope, and fear. For the first time, they realized the full extent of the power that had answered their desperate call for help. Yet even as relief began to creep into their hearts, the scale of destruction and chaos was staggering. Cities were in ruins, vital supply routes obliterated, and the skies above Thrin were filled with debris from countless destroyed vessels. The planet itself seemed to tremble under the force of the conflict. For the alien attackers, the breaking point was approaching rapidly. Their commanders had underestimated both the determination of the Thrinians and the ferocity of the Deathworlders. Entire fleets were being destroyed with surgical precision, their leaders incapacitated, and their ground operations sabotaged. Panic and confusion spread through their ranks. Ships that had once been symbols of strength now drifted lifelessly in space, disabled and abandoned. On the ground, soldiers were caught in ambushes and tactical traps set by the Deathworlders' forces. Their every attempt to regroup was thwarted, leaving them desperate and disorganized. The psychological impact of facing an opponent so merciless and precise began to erode their morale. The Deathworlders themselves were a vision of controlled chaos. Despite the overwhelming destruction they unleashed, every action was guided by strategy and discipline. Their warships moved in coordinated formations, exploiting weaknesses in enemy defenses. Boarding parties struck at critical installations, neutralizing command centers and supply hubs. Their weapons were deployed with exact timing, ensuring maximum impact with minimum waste. For the Thrinians, observing from below, it was a terrifying spectacle, a combination of precision engineering and sheer human will. The fleet's efficiency was unlike anything they had ever seen, making them question the limits of human capability. As the enemy forces faltered, the Deathworlders intensified their attacks. They recognized that hesitation could allow the attackers to regroup or flee, prolonging the conflict and increasing the risk to Thrin civilians. Entire battalions of alien ships were annihilated in swift, decisive strikes. On the planet's surface, fortified enemy positions were overrun, and key strategic points were secured. The Deathworlders left no room for counterattacks, their approach leaving a clear message: resistance was futile. Their reputation, long whispered across the galaxy, was now proven in action. The Thrinians, who had previously lived in fear of invasion, now witnessed firsthand why the Deathworlders were both feared and respected. The enemy commanders realized too late that they had underestimated the situation. They had believed that the Thrinians' distress signal would attract ordinary reinforcements, not an unstoppable human fleet whose strategy and combat prowess surpassed anything they had encountered. Attempts to negotiate or retreat were ignored, as the Deathworlders' doctrine allowed no room for hesitation. Every move made by the enemy was met with a counter that seemed almost preordained, as if the Deathworlders anticipated their thoughts before they were even acted upon. The alien forces, once confident and numerous, were now reduced to fragmented groups, struggling to survive against an opponent whose power seemed limitless. On Thrin, the breaking point was not only physical but emotional. The citizens, having endured weeks of fear and despair, now faced the overwhelming reality of battle on a scale they had never imagined. Families had lost homes, neighborhoods had been destroyed, and the sound of explosions had become a constant backdrop. Yet, amid the chaos, hope surged. The presence of the Deathworlders transformed panic into determination. Soldiers who had been on the verge of surrender now found renewed courage, inspired by the efficiency and strength of their saviors. Civilians, once paralyzed by fear, began to assist in whatever way they could, tending to the wounded, reinforcing shelters, and providing support to those defending the planet. The breaking point was also psychological for the Thrinians' attackers. They had believed themselves invincible, but the Deathworlders' intervention shattered that illusion. Commanders could see the futility of their strategies, and soldiers began to question whether survival was even possible. Desertion and surrender became more common as the relentless pressure of the human fleet left little room for hope. The Deathworlders did not celebrate these victories. They did not need to. Their focus remained on the mission: neutralize the threat and secure the planet. Every action was purposeful, and the results spoke for themselves. One of the most striking moments in this phase of the conflict was the coordination between the Deathworlders' fleet and ground forces. While their ships devastated enemy formations in space, teams on the planet moved with equal precision. Enemy fortresses were infiltrated and neutralized, supply lines cut, and key strategic positions captured. The Deathworlders' ability to operate seamlessly in both space and on the surface was unprecedented. For the Thrinians, it was a revelation. They had always believed that survival depended on technology and numbers, but now they witnessed how strategy, skill, and human ingenuity could overcome even the most formidable odds. The destruction wrought during the breaking point was both shocking and necessary. Entire enemy divisions were eradicated, their ships left drifting as lifeless hulks. The skies above Thryn were filled with the remnants of the battle smoke, fire, and debris moving in silent, eerie patterns. Despite the devastation, the planet's defenders began to feel a sense of relief. The tide of battle had turned irrevocably in their favor. The presence of the Deathworlders ensured that the enemy could no longer launch coordinated attacks, and the remaining forces were scattered and disorganized. It was clear that survival was now within reach, though at a cost that would be remembered for generations. For the breaking point was not merely about defeating the enemy. It was about ensuring that no threat could rise again in the near future. They moved with calculated intensity, targeting not only immediate threats but potential future dangers. Strategic installations were secured, weapons caches destroyed, and enemy leaders captured or neutralized. Their approach was comprehensive, leaving no room for miscalculation. The Thrinians watched in awe as this force, forged from the deadliest worlds, reshaped the battlefield with a combination of intellect, strategy, and raw power. The alien attackers, now fragmented and demoralized, faced a decision: surrender or face total annihilation. Many realized that continued resistance was futile. Ships and ground units attempted to retreat, but the Deathworlders anticipated these moves. Pursuit was relentless, and escape became increasingly impossible. The once confident enemy was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, each overwhelmed by the humans' precision and coordination. The breaking point had been rich not only in terms of battle strategy but in the enemy's morale, their will to fight shattered by an opponent who had anticipated every move. Amid this chaos, the Thranians began to grasp the true magnitude of the Deathworlders' power. They had called for help, and what arrived was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The humans were not simply reinforcements, they were an unstoppable force capable of altering the course of entire wars. Their efficiency, speed, and coordination were unmatched, and their presence alone had turned the tide of battle. The citizens, once consumed by fear, now felt a mixture of awe and gratitude. They had survived the darkest hours, not through their own strength, but through the intervention of a civilization that embodied both wrath and protection. That as the battle reached its climax, the full consequences of the breaking point became clear. Enemy forces were annihilated or in full retreat. Thryn's cities were spared from total destruction, and the planet's inhabitants could finally begin to breathe with a sense of safety. The Deathworlders had delivered a decisive blow, ensuring not only the survival of the Thrinians but also sending a clear message to any who might threaten them in the future. Their intervention had been absolute, leaving no ambiguity about the cost of aggression against a world under their protection. For the Thrinians, the experience was transformative. They had faced annihilation, endured weeks of fear and despair, and now witnessed a civilization whose power and efficiency seemed almost supernatural. The breaking point had tested every aspect of their society, from leadership and military strategy to the resilience of ordinary citizens, and yet it had also revealed the potential for survival, hope, and the extraordinary impact of intervention by those capable of decisive action. The Thrinians began to understand the dual nature of the Deathworlders. They were saviors, yet terrifying in their efficiency and power. They could protect, but only through overwhelming force. They could ensure survival, but at the cost of witnessing devastation on an unprecedented scale. For the first time, the Thrinians realized that the galaxy was larger, more dangerous, and more complex than they had ever imagined. Their call for help had not just brought reinforcements, it had awakened a force that would forever alter their understanding of power, survival, and the consequences of desperation. And so, as the enemy forces were shattered, as the skies cleared of immediate threat, and as Thryn's inhabitants began to cautiously emerge from their shelters, the breaking point passed. It marked a turning of the tide, the decisive moment when hope was restored, and the extraordinary might of the Deathworlders was revealed in its full, awe-inspiring glory. The planet had survived its darkest hours, but the memory of this conflict would remain etched in its history forever, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the astonishing power that could be summoned when desperation met determination. After the breaking point of the battle, Thryn's skies and cities were eerily quiet, yet the silence carried with it a sense of fragile victory. The alien forces had been defeated or scattered, and the Death, having executed their swift and decisive campaign, were now focused on stabilizing the planet and ensuring that no immediate threats remained. For the Thrinians, the situation was almost surreal. They had survived what seemed like certain annihilation thanks to a civilization whose strengths and discipline exceeded anything they had ever imagined. The streets, though scarred and damaged, were beginning to see cautious activity as citizens emerged from shelters, surveying the remnants of battle and contemplating the cost of survival. The Death, however, did not linger in chaos or destruction. Unlike many other armies or fleets, their goal was not to conquer or exploit but to secure and protect. They moved methodically, coordinating their forces to rebuild critical infrastructure, provide medical support, and ensure that the remnants of enemy forces could not regroup. Their warships, still hovering above the planet, served both as deterrents and as command centers for the ongoing operation. Soldiers on the ground worked alongside engineers and technicians, repairing communication arrays, restoring energy grids, and stabilizing essential systems that had been destroyed during the conflict. For the Thrinians, the efficiency and organization of these efforts were astonishing. The first priority for the Deathworlders was the protection of civilians. Every effort was made to evacuate those who had been trapped or injured during the battle. Medical teams moved quickly, treating wounds, setting up field hospitals, and providing supplies for basic needs. Even with the chaos left in the wake of the conflict, the Deathworlders ensured that no citizen was left behind. Their approach was not one of charity but of precision and responsibility. Any failure to protect life could lead to instability, further conflict, or future threats. The Thrinians, who had lived in constant fear for weeks, now witnessed an unparalleled dedication to their survival. In parallel, the Deathworlders worked to neutralize any lingering enemy presence. Scout teams and reconnaissance units moved through both space and the planet's surface, identifying remaining hostile elements and preventing regrouping. Any captured soldiers or leaders were dealt with according to strict protocols, ensuring that they could not pose a threat in the future. The aliens who had underestimated the Deathworlders were either removed from the equation or carefully monitored. The message was clear. Thrin was under the protection of a civilization that would allow no further attempts at aggression. This decisive action reassured the Thrinians. Though the scale of the Deathworlders' methods was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, rebuilding the planet's infrastructure was a massive undertaking. Cities that had been bombarded, streets torn apart, and vital systems destroyed required immediate attention. The Deathworlders deployed construction teams alongside military units, using advanced technology to repair and reinforce structures. Communication networks, previously crippled, were restored, allowing Thrin's leaders to coordinate the recovery process. Power grids, water systems, and emergency services were stabilized, often with technology far beyond what the Thrinians had developed themselves. Each intervention demonstrated the Deathworlders' ability not only to destroy efficiently but also to restore and protect with equal precision. The Thrinians themselves were deeply involved in this recovery, guided and assisted by the Death. For the first time in weeks, the citizens could actively participate in shaping their world's future. Soldiers who had been defending the planet were now reassigned to support rebuilding efforts. Engineers collaborated with human technicians, and civilians assisted in clearing debris and establishing safe zones. The cooperation between the Deathworlders and the Thrinians created a sense of empowerment, a realization that survival and recovery were possible when guided by strength, strategy, and disciplined action. During this period, the Deathworlders also took steps to ensure long-term stability. They established defensive outposts around the planet and in orbit, designed to prevent any future attacks. These outposts were manned not only with personnel but also equipped with advanced detection and weaponry systems, creating a formidable deterrent against any potential aggressors. The Thrinians, though initially intimidated by these measures, gradually came to understand their necessity. They realized that the Deathworlders were not leaving them exposed once the immediate threat was neutralized. Instead, they were creating conditions for lasting security, ensuring that Thrin could rebuild without fear of renewed assault. The political and social structures of Thrin also required attention. Leaders who had been coordinating defense efforts now worked closely with Deathworlder advisors to reorganize governance, restore public order, and manage the allocation of resources. The Deathworlders provided strategic guidance, helping the Thrinians prioritize critical needs, rebuild trust in institutions, and establish new protocols to prevent future vulnerabilities. For the citizens, this period was transformative, revealing how coordinated planning and disciplined action could restore a society on the brink of collapse. Despite their efficiency and discipline, the Deathworlders were not infallible. They encountered challenges in balancing the urgency of recovery with the scale of destruction left by both the enemy and their own intervention. Cities had been partially destroyed, food and medical supplies were depleted, and many citizens had been traumatized by weeks of constant fear and conflict. Yet, even in these difficulties, the Deathworlders remained relentless. They adapted to the circumstances, deploying mobile units, providing temporary shelters, and using technology to compensate for material shortages. Their approach was always practical and direct, focused on results rather than ceremony or recognition. Throughout this process, the Thrinians began to see the dual nature of the Death. They were terrifyingly efficient in combat, capable of destroying entire fleets and armies without hesitation. Yet, when the conflict ended, their attention shifted to protection, recovery, and stabilization. They did not abandon the planet once the immediate threat was neutralized. Instead, they remained involved, guiding the Thrinians in rebuilding their civilization. This duality created a mixture of awe and gratitude among the inhabitants, who recognized that their survival was owed not only to the Deathworlders' power but also to their strategic foresight and sense of responsibility. The resolution phase also involved the careful management of remaining threats. While the main enemy forces had been destroyed, scattered groups still posed potential dangers. The Deathworlders deployed rapid response teams to track, contain, and neutralize these remnants, ensuring that no resurgence could occur. Surveillance systems were installed throughout the planet, providing early warning for any future incursions. The Thrinians, who had previously been overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, now felt a cautious sense of safety. They understood that the Deathworlders' intervention had not only solved the immediate crisis but had also established a framework for long-term protection. Another critical aspect of the resolution was the psychological impact on the Thrinian. Citizens who had been paralyzed by fear and despair were now witnesses to a civilization whose efficiency, power, and discipline were unparalleled. The presence of the Deathworlders instilled a sense of order and purpose, demonstrating that, even in the darkest circumstances, survival and recovery were achievable. Children who had hidden in shelters began to explore cautiously, soldiers regained confidence in their abilities, and leaders found guidance in rebuilding a society shaken to its core. The Deathworlders had not only restored physical security but had also inspired hope, resilience, and a renewed sense of agency. As the weeks passed, the planet began to stabilize. Essential services resumed, trade routes reopened, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Thrinians adapted to the presence of the Deathworlders, who continued to monitor the situation while providing guidance. Training programs were established, allowing Thrinians to improve their defenses and develop skills that could prevent future vulnerabilities. The fleet's departure was planned carefully, ensuring that Thrinn could maintain stability without a permanent human presence. Even as the Deathworlders prepared to leave, their influence and support had left an enduring mark on the planet's society. The resolution also emphasized the lessons learned from the conflict. The Thrinians understood that reliance on external aid required careful consideration, that survival depended on preparation, and that even in desperation, decisive action could change the course of events. They had witnessed the extraordinary capabilities of a civilization forged in extreme conditions, and this experience reshaped their understanding of power, strategy, and resilience. The presence of the Deathworlders had been transformative, not only in terms of physical protection but also in fostering knowledge, confidence, and a vision for a safer future. Finally, the resolution phase underscored the profound consequences of a single act. The SOS that had called the Deathworlders into action. A simple plea for help had triggered a sequence of events that saved an entire planet, reshaped the local balance of power, and left an indelible impression on both Thrinn and its citizens. The Deathworlders' intervention was decisive, absolute, and meticulous, demonstrating that in a universe of uncertainty, strength and strategic action could determine survival. For Thrinn, the resolution was more than the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new era, marked by security, knowledge, and the enduring memory of a civilization whose power had been both terrifying and life-saving. The aftermath of the resolution also revealed the depth of the Deathworlders' philosophy. They did not act for recognition, reward, or political gain. Their actions were guided by a combination of strategic necessity, survival instincts, and a sense of responsibility toward life under threat. The Thrinians, who had once viewed their attackers as an insurmountable force, now recognized that the Deathworlders were protectors in their own unique and formidable way. Every ship, every soldier, and every decision reflected a civilization that understood both the cost of conflict and the value of survival. By the time the Deathworlders prepared to depart, Thrinn was transformed. Its cities were stabilized, its citizens empowered, and its leaders equipped with knowledge and guidance to prevent future threats. The enemy had been vanquished, and the threat of renewed attacks minimized. The planet had survived a crisis that had once seemed insurmountable, and the memory of the Deathworlders' intervention would serve as a permanent reminder of both the dangers of the galaxy and the extraordinary power that could respond when hope was at its lowest. After the Deathworlders had completed their decisive intervention, Thrinn slowly began to settle into a fragile calm. The alien attackers were either eliminated, captured, or scattered to remote corners of space, unable to pose a threat for the foreseeable future. The skies, once filled with the flashes of weaponry and the roar of engines, were now quiet, save for the occasional patrol ship or repair drone. The planet's surface bore the marks of conflict, cities damaged, forests scorched, and infrastructure in ruins. Yet, amid this devastation, life began to return. For the first time in weeks, the Thrinians could breathe without the immediate threat of annihilation hanging over them. The aftermath of the conflict was both physical and emotional. Citizens emerged from shelters and fortified zones, cautiously surveying the damage. Families reunited, though not without sorrow for lives lost. Children walked among ruins, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, struggling to comprehend the destruction they had witnessed. Elderly Thrinians reflected on the enormity of the crisis, recalling tales of past hardships but realizing none had approached the scale of this catastrophe. The entire society had been tested, and the experience had left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the planet. The death, despite having neutralized the immediate threat, remained present long enough to ensure stability. They assisted in rebuilding key infrastructure. Power grids were restored, communication networks repaired, and essential services restarted. Their methods were efficient and precise, often exceeding the capabilities of the Thrinians themselves. Advanced construction units worked tirelessly to reconstruct shelters, repair damaged transport systems, and restore vital resources such as water and food supply chains. Every effort was guided by a principle of lasting security. Nothing was left vulnerable, and every repair had strategic foresight built into it. Medical assistance became another critical focus. Many civilians had been injured, either in combat or due to collateral damage, and their needs were urgent. Field hospitals, staffed with both Deathworlder and Thrinians medical teams, provided care that was both immediate and sophisticated. Treatments ranged from basic wound care to advanced surgical procedures, using technologies and methods that were new to the Thrinian. Those who had suffered trauma were given psychological support, helping them cope with the shock of prolonged conflict. In these moments, the Thrinians began to understand the full scope of the Deathworlders' approach. They were not only destroyers of threats but also restorers of life, healers as well as warriors. Beyond the immediate physical repairs, the Thrinians faced a task of reconstructing their social and political systems. Governance had been disrupted, communication networks destroyed, and leadership structures stressed to their limits. The Deathworlders provided strategic guidance to ensure stability. Council members were advised on restoring trust within the populace, prioritizing resources, and rebuilding governance frameworks that could withstand future crises. Lessons in organization, decision-making, and coordinated response became part of the political education for Thrin's leaders. Slowly, order returned, and citizens regained confidence in their society's ability to function despite the chaos they had endured. Reflection became a major proponent of the planet's recovery. The Thrinians spent time processing what had occurred, not just in terms of immediate survival but also in the broader context of their place in the galaxy. They had been isolated, vulnerable, and desperate, relying on the hope that a signal sent across space might reach someone willing and able to help. The arrival of the Deathworlders had not only saved their lives but also taught them lessons about the nature of power, responsibility, and intervention. They realized that while the galaxy was filled with potential threats, it also contained civilizations whose strength and discipline could tip the scales of survival. Many Thrinians began to reassess their own society and capabilities. The planet had been caught off guard, reliant on fragile defenses and limited technology. Leaders and engineers reflected on what could be done to avoid such vulnerability in the future. Military strategies were revised, emergency protocols updated, and training programs implemented to prepare civilians and soldiers alike for possible future conflicts. The presence of the Deathworlders had revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Thrin, serving as a catalyst for long-term development. The planet was no longer naive about its place in the galaxy. It had been tested, and the lessons learned were profound. Cultural reflection also took place. Stories of the SOS, the arrival of the Deathworlders, and the devastating battles became part of Thrin's narrative. Artists, historians, and storytellers began documenting the events, ensuring that future generations would understand both the peril and the salvation experienced by the planet. The memory of fear, desperation, and ultimate survival would be preserved not just as a record of history but as a moral and strategic lesson. That courage, cooperation, and sometimes reliance on external strength were essential components of survival in a universe fraught with danger. The emotional and psychological impact on the Thrinians was significant. Survivors who had once felt powerless now carried a sense of hope, tempered with respect for the extraordinary power that had intervened on their behalf. Children grew up hearing first-hand accounts of courage and survival, and adults reflected on their resilience under pressure. Communities, once fractured by fear, began to come together, strengthened by shared experience and the understanding that survival had been achieved through unity and decisive action. The Deathworlders' intervention became a symbol of both awe and gratitude, forever altering the Thrinians' perception of their own world and their place in the galaxy. As the Deathworlders prepared to depart, their presence remained a reassuring factor. Patrols continued for a time, ensuring that no remaining enemy forces could regroup. The fleet's departure was methodical, leaving behind a system of monitoring and early warning mechanisms. Thrin's citizens had learned to trust the careful planning and foresight of the Deathworld. Though the humans were leaving, The structures they implemented and the lessons they imparted would continue to protect the planet. This transition emphasized the long-term impact of their intervention. It was not a temporary rescue, but a transformation that enabled the Thrinians to survive independently in the future. Reflection on the conflict also included contemplation of the broader universe. Thrin had been just one of many planets potentially vulnerable to predatory forces. The arrival of the Deathworlders had shown that even a single plea for help could have galaxy-wide consequences. Citizens and leaders alike began to think strategically about alliances, communication, and the importance of understanding the balance of power. The experience transformed the Thrinians' approach to diplomacy, defense, and survival, instilling a recognition that vigilance and preparation were as critical as courage and hope. Some Thrinians took time to reflect on the nature of the Deathworlders themselves. They had been terrifying in their efficiency, relentless in combat, and awe-inspiring in power. Yet, their focus had never been cruelty or conquest. They had arrived in response to a call for help, neutralized the threat with precision, and ensured the survival and stability of the planet before departing. The paradox of their nature, both destructive and protective, became a point of fascination. Thrinians recognized that strength, when coupled with responsibility and discipline, could serve as a force for survival and justice. The aftermath also involved rebuilding trust within Thrin society. The citizens had been tested not only by external threats but also by the limits of their own resources and governance. As reconstruction efforts progressed, communities learned to cooperate more effectively. Leaders grew more decisive, and individuals realized the value of preparation and resilience. The lessons of vulnerability, desperation, and salvation became embedded in the culture of Thrin, shaping future generations' approach to both internal governance and interstellar relations. Over time, Thrin began to recover economically and socially. Trade routes were re-established, markets reopened, and resource distribution normalized. Technology transferred or shared by the Deathworlders was integrated into local systems, enhancing the planet's defenses and efficiency. Educational programs were implemented to teach both practical skills and strategic thinking, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to face unforeseen challenges. The SOS that had once been a desperate call for help had catalyzed a transformation in every aspect of Thrin society. As months passed, the Thrinians' perspective on their galaxy expanded. They understood that the universe contained both dangers and allies, that survival required not only courage and ingenuity but also the willingness to reach out for aid when necessary. The Deathworlders' intervention had been absolute, reshaping their understanding of power, strategy, and responsibility. The planet had been forever changed, not just in its physical and political structures but in the consciousness and collective memory of its people. Looking back, the Thrinians realized that their SOS had been more than a simple plea for help. It had been a turning point, a moment in which their survival hinged on the intervention of a civilization capable of extraordinary feats. The Deathworlders had arrived, not for glory or conquest, but to enforce survival, demonstrate power, and ensure that life on Thrin could continue. The planet had been saved, but more importantly, it had been transformed. Lessons in resilience, strategy, and the nature of strength would endure, shaping Thrin's future for generations. The aftermath of the conflict was a mixture of relief, reflection, and renewed purpose. Thrin's citizens had survived impossible odds, their planet had been preserved, and their society had been given the tools to rebuild stronger than before. The memory of fear, desperation, and ultimate salvation would remain forever etched in their history, a story of hope amidst chaos and the extraordinary consequences of a single call for help. The Deathworlders had departed, but their impact remained, a permanent reminder that, in a vast, dangerous universe, even the smallest plea could summon forces capable of reshaping destiny. And so, life on Thrin continued, transformed by experience and memory. The scars of battle were slowly healed, but the lessons learned were permanent. The citizens carried forward a deep understanding of both vulnerability and resilience, of the terrifying power that could exist in the universe, and of the extraordinary potential for survival when courage, strategy, and timely intervention converged. Thrin was no longer the same world it had been before the It had become stronger, wiser, and prepared, forever marked by the intervention that had saved it, and the reflection that would guide its future.